I've never really been a big fan of the iPhone, and one big reason is that each generation seems like an iterative step up from the prior generation, and it doesn't seem like Apple's willing to make any sort of big bets. That has changed with the iPhone 14 Pro, which is why I was super interested in it. On paper, we are moving to bigger camera sensors, we're moving away from the notch, and we're moving to an always on display, which all sound like great things. Over the past month, I've realized that you can paint it gold or you can paint it deep purple, but it's not going to change the fact that an iPhone is an iPhone. But would I recommend this to my friends that would use iOS devices? No. Let's talk about why. This is InnoIso, and this is the iPhone 14 Pro review. In terms of design, all the stuff that I talked about in my 13 Pro review carries over here. I don't like the ergonomics of the iPhone 14 Pro, or any modern iPhones. The fact is I use my phone without a case, and so it's uncomfortable for me to grip and hold on to an iPhone with these sharp edges. That's not the case for a lot of people who do use cases on their phone. It seems like Apple has found the optimal solution because the flatter that a design is, the more internal space that they can use for components. So they can pack the densest amount of components into the iPhone 14 Pro while people still get their same ergonomic experience of having a case around it. That's fine for them, doesn't work for me. In my mind, this is not a comfortable phone to use in one hand. Yes, it's not quite as large as many of the Android phones that I use, but because of its ergonomics, I'm frequently having to grip the other end of the phone with my 3 spare fingers, and so my thumb can't reach around in order to touch much of the screen. By alternative, in Android phones that have a more curved design, I can actually not grip the edges of the phone like this, and my thumb has more room to run. Technically, the camera bumps are larger on this model, I think, but I really didn't notice a huge difference. I tried using this on my iPhone 13 Pro's case, and it was just a few millimeters from fitting. The way you can recognize an iPhone 14 Pro is by the color. This is the deep purple color, which I know that many people will think just looks like a kind of graphite gray color, but in the right lighting, there's just the right hint of purple that I actually really appreciate. I love this color, and while I would have loved something a little bit brighter to show off a little bit more color, I'm perfectly fine with it, and I think this is still the best color of the iPhone. The frame is just as fingerprinty as ever, which means that it's only a good looking phone when you first get it out of the box, but that's quite alright because the matte back finish is actually pretty resistant for fingerprints. Now let's turn the phone around and look at the most obvious difference between this and the 13 Pro in the dynamic island. Honestly, the dynamic island is just comically large. Now technically I'm more used to using Android phones with tiny little camera hole punch cutouts, and this one's substantially larger in just about every single dimension. Now, I'm probably more happy that Apple decided to make it one unified hole punch rather than the kind of eye shape that were in a number of different renders and is actually on the phone without the kind of dead pixels around it. But that's the only thing that I'm happy about. The dynamic island, despite all of Apple's marketing, is horrible. It is just a terrible experience. While Apple showed off the way that the dynamic island would work when you're listening to music or when you're recording audio in the background or when you're watching a video in the background, that's the only times where the dynamic island actually shows its use. In most cases, it's just a massive dead spot in the middle of your phone, which means that the actual screen real estate of this phone is substantially smaller than a phone with a notch at the top. As we speak, Android manufacturers are doing everything they can to make the hole punch the smallest possible portion of the display, even by basically putting a screen in front of the hole punch, which is crazy technology. Meanwhile, Apple builds this. The big downside for me is since I'm a big YouTube watcher, if I watch anything but 16:9 aspect ratio video, then the dynamic island is going to be cutting into it. 18:9 aspect ratio video, there's a little bit of a slice, and if I basically zoom to full screen, then the dynamic island basically totally gets in the way, a lot more so than the notch did before it, which makes me wonder, why do we have the dynamic island? Yes, a lot of video content, including the content you're watching right now, is 16:9, which is fine because it's not going to cut it out unless you want a bigger display. But if you happen to, I don't know, watch TikTok, then the hole punch or dynamic island is still going to cut out a massive amount of your display.
The island gives TikTok videos little mustaches.
As far as interacting with the dynamic island, I've seen a lot of creators say that they would prefer if a single tap went into widget mode and a long press went into the full screen app mode. And I totally agree with that, but I don't really want to interact with the dynamic island in the first place. The fact is if you think about ergonomics, like having to reach up to the top of your screen to interact with the dynamic island for anything consistently seems like a bad experience. Oh, by the way, a lot of the functionality that's baked into the dynamic island could also be just used by using the control center. So pausing and playing or skipping a song on your music player could just be done with control center, and frankly, it's a little bit easier to get to. All Apple did was created a dynamic widget that is constantly on your display and constantly taking up space. If you wanted that in the first place, then Apple could have included it on prior iPhones, but I think most people would have turned it off because they just want the screen real estate. That's all I'm asking for. Just give me the screen real estate. Just take away Face ID. This might be a controversial opinion among a lot of Apple fans because a lot of Apple fans swear by Face ID and that it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. Now, fine, it's fast. It's actually better than most face recognition systems that we've ever seen on Android phones. But that being said, I would prefer to just have a side-mounted or under-screen fingerprint sensor, which is just as fast and it doesn't take up any of my display. Then a tiny little hole punch cutout. Very similar, ironically enough, to the Nothing phone. The Nothing phone looked like an iPhone in many ways if Apple decided to give up on Face ID. Knowing that on a pure hardware standpoint, iPhones are substantially faster than Android phones, I've always wondered why my iPhone felt substantially slower than just about every Android phone I used. And the reason is Face ID. When I'm pulling my iPhone out of my pocket, since I have to swipe up on the screen and look at it in order to unlock it, it usually takes longer than comparably just having my finger on the fingerprint sensor as I pull my Android phone out of my pocket. I'll show some side-by-side video and y'all can see for yourself whether it actually is faster in time. But the experience for me feels substantially faster. But I don't think I'm going to convince most iOS stands that under-display fingerprint sensors are a better solution, as long as they're on Android phones and not on iPhones, because that's just kind of how it works. Now, while we're on the display, let's talk about the other big change of the iPhone 14 Pro in the always-on display, which honestly, I'm incredibly excited for. I don't care if Android had it first. I'm well aware that Android had it first. I care that now all people who decide to use an iPhone, at least those that go for the Pro models, will have an always-on display and get the same feature set that Android users have had for quite some time. That's awesome, and I'm really excited for iPhone users. There are some benefits of the iPhone's always-on display. It specifically shows a lot more information, it's a lot more accessible, you can easily skip tracks in your music without having to open up a widget to be able to do so. All of that stuff is great, and it's one of the reasons why, in some ways, the iPhone's always-on display is better than many Android devices. But one of the reasons why Android devices switched from what used to be very detailed always-on display to a lot more compact, constrained always-on display is two things: battery life and accessibility or accidental touches, which the iPhone has been having problems with both. Now, personally, I haven't had quite as bad battery life as a lot of people have on their iPhone 14 Pro, but I have noticed that my iPhone 14 Pro has worse comparable battery life than my iPhone 13 Pro the same time last year. Now, whether this is due to the always-on display, I'm not quite sure because I don't want to turn it off for reasons that we'll talk about. But one reason that I do want to turn it off is because of the accidental touches. The always-on display automatically turns on as soon as you lock the phone, which means if you happen to be sliding it into your pocket or putting it on a desk and you happen to brush against the always-on display, then it will be active and it will basically activate whatever you touched. So for example, I have had many problems where I'm listening to music on my AirPods and I slide the phone into my pocket and I happen to skip tracks without trying to. That's dumb. And it's one of the reasons why all Android phones, when you first lock them, they first turn off the display before turning on the always-on display just a few seconds later. Or they don't have easily accessible controls that you might brush up against. The worst case scenario for the iPhone, is I was actually recording several audio recordings in order to script some of my videos. And so as I was doing so, I would turn on the recorder and I'd slide it into my chest pocket so it would be close to my mouth for the microphone. And as I slid it into my chest pocket, I would pause the audio, pause the recording. And then 30 minutes later, when I'm done with recording my script for a video, I pull the phone out of my pocket and I realize that there are only a few seconds worth of recording. And I get so mad. I think Apple should be able to fix this very, very easily, but it's just one of those things that they'll need to learn the same way that all Android manufacturers learned. One other kind of software bug or frustration that I had is, since I don't use Apple's default sleep function because I just get angry at some of the more specific settings, I set up my own personal My Sleep, which did all of the things like turning on Do Not Disturb that I wanted it to do. Unfortunately, there's no way for me to set My Sleep to automatically turn off the always on display at night. And so over the nights, the always on display is still on, and it's bright enough to shine a light on my ceiling. It's not overly bright that it would wake me up, but maybe that's one of the reasons why the battery life hasn't been that great. In general, the always on display is an incredibly, incredibly useful feature. The fact that I can just sit at my desk, set my phone up on a stand, and just glance in its direction whenever I need to check if I have notifications or check the weather before I go to lunch, that's fantastic. It's a great feature, and I'm so glad it's on iPhones. One coworker who's always used an iPhone, he's upgrading from the iPhone X, asked me whether it was distracting, which is a reasonable question. Like, if your phone's always on, do you get distracted by it more often? But my answer was, yes, technically I look at my phone more often, but since I'm not reaching over to pick up my phone and check the notifications, instead I can just glance at it to see if I have notifications. All of those times that I'm glancing at it are shorter times, so I think in total, on average, I've trained myself to look at my phone less often. Speaking of Apple's focus settings, if you happen to log out of your iCloud account, which I might have happened to do, and remove it from your iPhone, your focus settings will go with them. So My Sleep functionality unfortunately went away, which means that Do Not Disturb was turned off in the middle of the night. So the iPhone happened to wake me up at 4 in the morning, which never makes me happy. Another massive change that came with the iPhone 14 Pro and all of the iPhones 14 is the removal, at least in the United States, of the SIM card. Now, my initial reaction to this, despite the internet kind of going wild about it, my initial reaction was fine. For me, I'm not too worried. Even as a reviewer who constantly just swaps SIM cards and phones, since I use Google Fi, often instead of swapping SIM cards, I can just log into my Google Fi account on the next phone that I want to use and activate it from there. So I had assumed that with eSIM, the whole experience would be absolutely fine. I've used eSIM on my iPhone 13 mini, which the review should be out, but it will come out soon if not. And I didn't have any problems with it whatsoever. But for whatever reason, none of the carriers were ready for the iPhone 14 release. Like, none. Some of them did better than others, but if you happen to have maybe T-Mobile and Sprint, like, the experience could have been very bad. And if you happen to have an MVNO carrier, then you would probably have to call them, or worst case scenario, go into some sort of store to get some sort of activation code. I heard a lot of horror stories across just about all carriers, save for Verizon, I didn't hear a lot, which is kind of frustrating and probably should have been looked into beforehand, but it seems like no one was prepared for this launch. Me personally, since I had Google Fi, I tried to activate my iPhone for an entire day after I received it just by going online and following all the steps. And what ended up working is when I actually opened up a chat with Google Fi, it took about 30 minutes for me to finally activate my iPhone. Not the best situation, but it worked. And so my recommendation is when you switch to your new iPhone, then probably reach out to your carrier as you're doing so you don't have to do so later on in the process. I'm not much of an international traveler, but I know it can have some implications on international travel. For me, all it matters is that I can just activate my phone, which the eSIM hopefully will get better at over time. So I'm not too worried about the eSIM experience for myself. The last thing I'll talk about is the cameras, which on the iPhone 14 Pro should have had a big improvement, now switching to a 48 megapixel main shooter and then upgrades on the wide angle and telephoto. Honestly, my experience on the iPhone 14 Pro was not substantially better than my iPhone 13 Pro. Yes, technically I could now shoot 2x zoom on the primary shooter and it would come out better than the iPhone 13 Pros, but not to a substantial degree, and I don't really use that zoom all that often in the first place. I would have loved to see a true like 5 or 10x telephoto lens, just the same way that we have on the Galaxy S22 Ultra or now the Pixel 7 Pro. That would have been great to see on an iPhone, but Apple doesn't really want to play this spec game, it seems. One major miss that I saw on the iPhone 14 Pro is in night mode. I consistently got better photos out of my Galaxy Z Fold 4 or my Galaxy S22 Ultra, because it could actually use night mode in all situations, and if I wanted it to force night mode, I could. Now, if I did a large camera comparison between this and my Galaxy series and eventually my Pixel 7 Pro, I'm sure the photos would be more comparable in quality and some wins would go to the iPhone. I'll link to a very good video that does just that with the Pixel 6 Pro from last year. But often what I prefer on most Android phones is the color science, and the iPhone's color science is just not for me. It's just a little bit too bland and too flat. On the flip side, unsurprisingly, the video quality on the iPhone 14 Pro is incredible. Now, I'm not going to use any sort of the features like the super cropped in like steady shot that you would get on GoPros. It doesn't really matter too much to me. I do like taking B-roll shots on my iPhone 14 Pro, but it doesn't require that sort of tight, fluid movement. Instead, I can use the standard stabilization on the iPhone 14 Pro, which is substantially better than most Android phones that I use. I fully expected the iPhone 14 Pro to have all the great things from the iPhone 13 Pro with just some additional features, which is kind of the Apple MO, but that wasn't what I got here. The iPhone 14 Pro, to my surprise, took some risks, and in my mind, they swung and missed on most of those risks. The eSIM support is still not the best situation. The always-on display, while great, it still needs to work out some kinks. And frankly, I don't think it should be just on the iPhone 14 Pro, but whatever. Then, finally, the dynamic island is the least dynamic. It is incredibly static, and it is not impressive whatsoever. If Apple just got rid of it, I would be so much happier. If Apple just went back to the notch, I would probably be happy as well. That sucks. I never thought I'd be in a situation where I was fighting for the notch, but here I am. Now, before this year is out, I plan to review one more iPhone, and that's the iPhone 14 Plus, which, despite not getting a spec bump from the iPhone 13, it really feels like the big upgrade this year, but we'll talk about that in that review. Thank you for watching InnoIso. I hope you liked this review of the iPhone 14 Pro. If you did, be sure to let me know down in the comments, give me a like, and get subscribed to the channel for more videos just like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. If the rumors are correct, we might still see some real upgrades from Apple this year in the form of new technology, which is really exciting for someone like me who doesn't like iterative products. So if you're interested in my coverage of that, be sure to get subscribed right now. Oh, speaking of the battery life, my experience was that the iPhone 14 Pro wasn't quite the 2-day phone that the iPhone 13 Pro was. It was more like a day and a half, but that's still better than a lot of smaller Android phones that I have. So it was good enough. I didn't really have many problems with it.